with a human bomb killed Rajiv Gandhi on spot. The actual killer died on the spot. 50,000 people witnessed that killing. And yet when the matter came to court, our SIT went to the first conspirator, those who supplied the vehicles, those who supplied the arms, those who supplied the shelter, those who harbored them, those who planned the conspiracy. Our SIT got all of them. The SIT did a remarkable job in reconstructing the whole crime. And finally the SIT found, just as we don't have any eyewitnesses of what happened in Karachi or the terrorist training camps, the SIT did not have any eyewitnesses of what the conspirators were doing behind closed doors. Conspiracies are hatched in darkness. They are behind closed doors. They don't leave eyewitnesses behind. So it's only when the first conspirator sang, the second conspirator spoke, that their evidence under TADA became admissible evidence, and the conviction of the other accused in the Rajiv Gandhi assassination case took place only because of the admissibility of those confessions. Take those confessions out and this country would have been a laughing stock, where a former prime minister is assassinated in front of 50,000 people and you wouldn't have had a conviction in the case. The actual assassins had died on spot. Take the parliament attack case. The 5 actual persons who attacked Indian parliament died within this premises itself. It's the conspirators who were arrested. And the most material evidence against the conspirators is a lot of what some of them, the first man and the second man who were arrested, those who spoke. Now it's always been said, and this is not only in this case, and I'll come to it a little later, what is it which is required in a strong anti-terror law? And I always tell my friends in the government, when India is on the terrorist radar, you don't have to be apologetic about India having a strong anti-terror law. We are supporting this government on this anti-terror law. But the difference between the ruling benches and the opposition this time is, the opposition is supporting this bill as a national necessity. The ruling party is still embarrassed and is apologetic about having brought this bill. That's the difference. It's a strange dichotomy in Indian democracy which has taken place. We are more enthusiastic about what the government is about bringing a law of this kind. Now you require an anti-terror law. The government repealed POTA. But then their security experts told them, why are you making India so vulnerable? Sir, I did an exercise as to what was there in POTA. Of course, I'm conscious of the fact that such a remedy is not available. But if for hijacking or copying an intellectual property, an action was available, I think the NDA had a strong case against the UPA. We drafted a law, they said it's a horrible law, we will repeal it. And then took a scissor and a pasting exercise and started sculling out provision by provision from POTA, and word by word, full stop by full stop. And if we had left a grammatical mistake somewhere, along with that grammatical mistake, started incorporating it in the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. I just started comparing the features, the language, the verbatim, the language are the same. The law must define terrorism, so they repealed POTA, which defines terrorism. They picked up that definition and put it in the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. POTA was criticized because it had an extraterritorial application. Obviously it's needed, because if one limb of the conspiracy takes place in Pakistan, an anti-terror law will necessarily have an extraterritorial application. So you brought it back by the 2005 amendment. The quantum of punishment required under POTA, you picked it up and brought it back. Now, besides an act of terrorism, we said whoever abates terrorism, whoever incites terrorism will also be an offense or a lesser offense. They picked up the language, pasted it in another law. Harboring terrorists, picked up and pasted in another law. Membership of a terrorist organization, again picked up from quota, verbatim put in another law. Confiscation of proceeds of terrorism. Now this was based on a salutary principle that no person can benefit from profits of crime. You commit a crime and out of the profits of that crime you buy a house or you open a bank account or you keep money. So the properties will be confiscated if they are out of terrorist funds, or those will be confiscated. They said, very good concept, let us put it back. If you threaten witnesses in a terrorism case, that also is an offense. Verbatim taken and put in the act. Declaration of an organization as a terrorist organization. Picked up the provisions verbatim and put it in the other act. Special procedure, special laws, picked up the procedures, picked up the sections, placed them in another act. And then, let me compliment, the Home Minister is not here, Mr. Sibal is here. And Mr. Sibal's favorite argument is that my law is better than your law. So the remand period we provided, Mr. Sibal's argument, which I have answered for the last 4.5 years, was the special law is not required. Mr. Sibal is a man of principles. You see, he opposes it on Republican principles. He brings this law back on principles of preserving national sovereignty. In any case, he stands by those principles, and he will justify his principle at all stages.
For national sovereignty, as you know.
Yes.
Republicans are not against national sovereignty.
But I think in that event, with all these provisions had to be brought back,
You know the Republicans around the world.
if all these provisions had to be brought back, there was no need why India should have been made so vulnerable for 4 years and 7 months.
That we will tell you at the procedure.
For 4 years and 7 months, you made this country vulnerable, and then you decided to bring the same law back. Then, sir, the law said, well, there is a remand period mentioned in the old law. We'll now have a discretion for a larger remand period. Well enough, because if the investigation does not conclude in 90 days, you may require 180 days. And therefore, you may require to get evidences internationally, you may have to send letters of entries across the globe to get evidences, you may have to deport people from other countries. Therefore, longer periods of investigation will be required. And therefore, they put a provision giving some element of flexibility. Yes, longer remand is required. It's a correct provision in law. I have no difficulty with that. On dozens of occasions, we've been told in this house, you turned the law upside down by shifting the onus of proof. There are no presumptions which are available. Now the presumptions available in POTA have been exactly brought back. And what are those presumptions? The Evidence Act has those presumptions. There is a chapter for presumptions in the evidence law. Well, if a weapon is found in your possession, the presumption is it is yours unless you disprove the fact it is not yours. If your fingerprints are found on a vehicle, on the steering wheel of a vehicle which is used for a terrorist offense, the presumption is you have used that vehicle. The onus is on you to prove that you had not used that vehicle. The section number has been altered, sir. That presumption now is back. Confiscation of passports, setting up of review committees. In fact, POTA had a very interesting safeguard with regard to intercepts. Obviously, a large part of criminal law investigation these days is done on the strength of taping telephonic conversations and intercepts. Now, doubt arose whether these are admissible evidence. But POTA provided a safeguard. The safeguard under POTA was, if a police officer wants to intercept, then from the competent authority he must take sanction. And every fortnight the review committee headed by a judge will certainly get the total record of whatever and the people whose intercepts have been made. And these intercepts will be admissible evidence in a court. further. You said no sanctions are required. The intercepts from wherever you get are admissible evidence. Well, the police was facing a difficulty. If you want to go that far, I have no difficulty. We'll support you even on that. But don't be apologetic about the fact that India didn't need a strong anti-terror law. It's an admission of the fact that you made this country vulnerable for 4 years and 7 months. And now you've come back to say, well, India does need a special law. You can't fight terror with ordinary laws. Sir, there were 2 vital provisions left out. And the 2 vital provisions are, one with regard to a special bail provision, and the second with regard to confessions. So as far as bail provisions were concerned, under your normal criminal law, you have the bailable offences, the non-bailable offences where the discretion is with the court. There are special laws in which the discretion of the court in granting bail is further reduced. The court can't grant bail till a public prosecutor has been noticed. And if the court comes to an opinion, at the stage of bail, that prima facie the case is true, or prima facie the case is not false, just a prima facie case view, the court will not grant bail. Now this provision, we had been repeatedly saying you require a stronger provision, because once a terrorist gets bail, and if he is an international jihadi, after getting bail he is not going to come back and say, well, I am coming back for the purposes of getting executed in India. So he certainly is going to jump bail. Therefore, why do you not have special provisions with regard to bail? Now the present law has brought that provision back, but then the UPA is not NDA, so you have to be different. So the earlier law said, prima facie the case against him is not true, the judge will grant bail. You said he will not grant bail if he is proved that prima facie the case against him is true. So one had a direct mention, the other alternative has double negatives. The two mean exactly the same. So you said, well, we have a different bail provision now. And you brought back, and there is nothing wrong with this bail provision. So I have just prepared a list. TADA had this bail provision, POTA had this. But besides an anti-terrorism law, there were other laws in India. There are at least 12 laws in India which have the same bail provision. The Makoka has the same bail provision. The Andhra Pradesh and the Karnataka organized crime laws have the same provision. But then the government said we are against these organized crime laws, so we are not allowing some BJP-ruled governments to have those laws. But your Narcotics Act has the identical bail provision. Not only the Narcotics Act, I have copies, sir. You have similar bail provisions besides the Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act, Scheduled Caste and Scheduled Tribe Prevention of Atrocities Act, Anti-Hijacking Act, Prevention of Damage to Public Property Act, Prevention of Money Laundering Act, and then even suppression of unlawful acts against safety of maritime navigations. You have the same bail provisions, which are those extraordinarily hard bail provisions. Suppression of unlawful acts against safety of civil aviation. Terrorist affected areas Special Courts Act. And finally, even the Wildlife Protection Act. So those who commit these offences against wildlife would not get bail. But those who committed these crimes against humanity, terrorist offences, were entitled under this government for 4 years and 7 months to lighter bail provisions. And they said, no, we won't have it. Finally, I think where all our logic and rationality failed, you have those 10 evil men who came on 26/11, convincing the whole country and then pressurizing this government to reluctantly come up and strengthen the bail provisions. Even confession, sir, on the face of it, it may look a little alarmist. And I concede to this that ordinarily in a law, confessions to a police officer is not admissible evidence. Should not be. That's the normal law. In all our laws, this should be the general principle. Then we in India have exceptions. We in India even today have exceptions. Tada and Pota were exceptions. Makoka is an exception. Karnataka organized crime law is an exception. Andhra organized crime law is an exception. The narcotics law is an exception. You make a statement to an officer investigating a narcotics offense, your statement is admissible evidence. You make a statement to a customs officer, it's an admissible evidence. You have in foreign jurisdictions, in liberal democracies, these statements become admissible evidence provided the judge is satisfied with regard to the voluntariness of the nature of the confession. And the Supreme Court said this is extremely important. If obviously the confession is involuntary or appears to be involuntary, it should be disregarded. But they said, how do you then ensure that there is no misuse? 4 guidelines were suggested. 1, the officer recording the confession must be SP or above. 2, it must preferably be video recorded or audio recorded. 3, within 24 hours or 48 hours as the government decides, the accused must go before a judge after making the confession. The judge will ask him if it is voluntary. If he says it's involuntary, he will have him medically examined. And all these factors will be considered in order to determine the nature, voluntary nature of that confession. Now on one hand, you have an extraordinary crime, and that extraordinary crime is a crime against the state, a crime planned in secrecy, where there will never be an eyewitness. I repeat, those who conspired in secret meetings to assassinate the late Shri Rajiv Gandhi, no investigation could ever produce eyewitnesses of that. One of them had to speak. And if his statement was not evidence, then there would be no evidence. If Kasab's statement is not evidence, then it's extremely difficult for India to prove what happened in the Karachi or the Pakistan limb of this conspiracy. But then, when you've gone so far, why do you stop halfway? When you want to create a national investigative agency, why don't you give it the tooth that it needs in order to investigate a crime and produce before the world and the Indian courts evidence which is required in relation to these crimes? Sir, if these are not, if these essentials are not there, then I am afraid, even though we've moved half a step further, there will be cases and cases where we will still fall short. And there are enough people waiting really to find holes in the Indian case. I am not referring to this as the police case. This is not a case. At times we are in the habit of discussing, well, so many attacks took place when you were in power or when I was in power, or somebody else was in power. This is the Indian case. There are enough people waiting. You had articles written, books written, which said the attack on Parliament was organized by the RNAW and the IB. You have Indians authoring such books, writing articles in newspapers suggesting this. We may all be magnanimous and be willing to pass off yesterday's statement of Mr. Antule merely as an irresponsible act or something where he perhaps did not adequately express himself. But then his statement is huge fuel for the country which has been extending facilities to terrorists in action against India. Read the blogs in Pakistan today.
Sir, my good friend cannot mention the name of a person who is not a member of this.
What is this here? What is wrong with that?
And he is already, he is not here, he is not here. And he's already denied it on the floor of the House.
This is a parliamentary record. Today all the newspapers are carrying that story.
According to him, he has denied it, it seems.
Mr. Antule said what ISI
Denial compounds it. What he said in the so-called denial, it compounds it, sir.
Sir, I think Mr. Sibal is right. I really should not have named him. The government itself should have named him today morning. But this is something which has embarrassed this country. This has weakened our case internationally. Something which defies the collective responsibility of the cabinet. Something which provides ammunition to our enemies and opponents. And therefore, I should not name them. The substance should be the government itself should have come up and shrugged off its any relationship with the person who makes this kind of a statement.
The Congress spokesman said that it is his personal view. It is not the Congress stand.
Sir,
He is not denying.
sir, therefore today, on a strong anti-terror law, where are we? The whole country was misled, we don't need a law. The law was repealed. Then, sentence after sentence, clause after clause of that law was brought back. But then you wanted to have that one upmanship and say, well, we are different because this one provision is not there. And that one provision is a significant provision. With safeguards, unless that provision is there, in case after case, you will be weakening India's case. And I reiterate and say, if that provision had not been there in Tada, the accused in Rajiv Gandhi's case would have benefited. If it had not been in Pota, the accused in the parliament case would have benefited. And since that was not there, fortunately Mumbai has Makoka which has that provision. But for some reason I am told, Makoka has still not been pressed into action in the 2611 case. And unless that statement is a statement under Makoka which becomes evidence, the Karachi and the Pakistan limb of the conspiracy may be difficult to establish in law. And therefore we will require to do that. So please reconsider. When you've traveled all this distance and wisdom has dawned on you in the last 5 months of your government, please don't make it an incomplete step. The Home Minister was candid enough to say he had consultations with the opposition. We made it very clear to him that we will, come what may, even if it's half a step, we will support half a step. We have our own nationalist credentials and therefore we don't want to stop that half step. But then please make India a strong state. This law per se will not abolish terrorism. Merely because we have an Indian penal code, crime has not ended. Because we have section 302 which provides for death penalty or life penalty, murders have not stopped. Murders are still taking place, but law provides a deterrent in a civilized society. It provides an expeditious methodology of investigation and punishment. And therefore, please give this law more teeth than what exists today. Sir, the second part of this amendment, in the second bill, is the setting up of a national investigative agency. As I have said, as far as the first law is concerned, we have supported it because it's half a step. We have reservations about what's not being done and we'll continue to campaign for that. But as far as the National Investigative Agency is concerned, I have no hesitation in saying that we fully support the proposal as has been mooted by the government. And this is for two good reasons. First, some doubts are at times raised whether central government possesses the power to take over what appears to be a power within the state jurisdiction. So the constitutional entries make it very clear. Defense of India in list 1 entry 1 is the exclusive primary domain of the central government. It's public order which includes law and order, which is the domain of a state government. Where does terrorism fit in? Terrorism is not merely law and order. Terrorism is something which attacks the sovereignty of India, it attacks the unity of India. And therefore, if it's cross-border terrorism of this kind, it has something directly to do with the defense of India. And therefore, even the Supreme Court, when Tada was first enacted and Pota was first enacted, an objection was taken with regard to the legislative competence of the centre to enact an anti-terror law on the ground that the law and order is a state subject. But the Supreme Court also said that there is no entry called terrorism in the Constitution And therefore, this could perhaps come within the defense of India and not public order. And if it doesn't fall in either, then it comes within the residuary entry list 1 entry 97. And therefore, this is exclusively within the central domain. To protect the sovereignty of India is a responsibility of the central government, and therefore against terrorism, if a law is brought, it is within the central domain. And if an agency is created to investigate that offense, then obviously those who have the competence to enact a law also have the competence to create an agency of that kind. And therefore we fully support the government's proposal that the central government is fully competent to enact this law. Even otherwise, sir, an offense of terrorism in some cases may not adequately be investigated by a state police. There may be offenses which have an interstate ramification. You may require sharing of intelligence between several states. You may require coordination of intelligence of all those states. You may have different limbs of the conspiracy in different states. You may even have, as this law has extraterritorial application, some parts of the conspiracy taking place outside India, some intelligence required from outside India. Now there may be offenses where all this is not present and the central agency itself may feel the state police can do it. But in an extraordinary case like the one in Mumbai or like the one of the parliament attack, these may be cases where a state police itself may be inadequate to investigate the offense. And by the very nature of the offense, a central agency would be more competent, sir, in order to investigate that offense. And therefore we fully support of the proposal of the central government as far as the creation of a central agency is concerned, with a discretion that some extraordinary offenses of this kind, when they take place, the central agency itself will investigate those offenses. Finally, sir, let us realize, while we are debating this law, this country has paid a huge cost of terrorism. We've lost individuals, we've lost human life, we've lost lives of security personnel. A large part of our national resource gets spent on it. Where there is terrorism, investment is not forthcoming. Your economic resources are diverted to fight terrorism. You may even have a diversion as far as your defense preparedness is concerned, where instead of looking at your borders, you are looking at the interiors where terrorist activities are taking place. Anti-insurgency steps, anti-terror steps at times are strong. Mr. Chidambaram was right when he says we have to do a balancing act between human rights and fighting terror. And therefore there may be some erosion at some stage of individual rights. Harsh combing operations at times lead to alienation of local population. These are all costs we have to pay because of fighting terrorism. And therefore, when this is the kind of cost this country has to pay, I think we need not be, while we should be concerned about human rights and balance them in our fight against terror, but at the same time, we should not be apologetic in a state whose sovereignty is threatened in taking strong anti-terror steps. And therefore, once we have decided, this government has decided that it has a change of hearts, though what we failed for 4 years and 7 months, those 10 men who came from across the border have persuaded them in doing so, that they brought this law. But then let it be an adequate exercise. It can't be an incomplete exercise. And as I said, we on this side support these measures as one of national necessity. And the government should not be apologetic about having brought any of these measures. Thank you very much, sir.
Yes. Thank you, Sri Arun Jaitley ji. Thank you. Sri Abhishek Manoj Singh ji.
Chairman, sir, I heard my friend Mr. Jaitley with rapt attention. He gave the Home Minister a compliment, which was obviously a compliment based on fiction, because he reacted to a newspaper report, and obviously because Mr. Jaitley can't be privy to cabinet proceedings. So since there is no basis as to what happened, and Mr. Chidambaram clarified that, the compliment itself was based on fiction, therefore the withdrawal was also fictional. But I must actually partly withdraw the compliment I was about to give the opposition, because I was misled into thinking that this is in fact a non-contentious debate. And that's the good thing about it. It's supposed to be a non-contentious debate. They are supposed to support us, but my friend could not repeatedly resist the temptation of being self-congratulatory. He could not repeatedly resist the temptation of saying, "We told you so." As I will presently show, his self-congratulatory approach is not fully justified, although the support which his party gives us, we welcome it in the national interest. But before we go further, let me deal with the preliminary aspect about the statement of a learned member of parliament, a minister, yesterday. I think my friend is being less than fully fair. At 5 o'clock, minutes after the statement was made, the Congress party officially, in its press briefing in Parliament House, categorically and specifically repudiated and rejected the statement and said, "We neither support, accept." Having said that, that was repeated the whole evening yesterday. Today I am told the learned minister has himself retracted and modified or clarified it. And I fail to understand when it's not a Government of India statement, when it's not a Congress statement, when it's not a UPA statement. I ask myself how Pakistan or any other country in the world can rely on it and say it's the Government of India stand. We so. Okay, let me complete. He's a minister, but the Government of India, the ruling coalition and the party has said we don't accept that statement. Well, I want to ask you, my friend, when you one day later, Mr. Agarwal, when you one day later after our contemporaneous clarification, please let me speak. One day later after my contemporaneous clarification and after his own clarification, if you raise it again and again, are you not, ask yourselves, are you not politicizing the issue for the whole world? And are you not making it a political issue? The issue should rest now in view of the clear clarification then. But sir, may I come back to the main business? This is not the main business. The main business is that this government, this house means business. It means the business of sending a clear signal across the world that the country is united, that it is doing a holistic approach, administrative, legal, factual, logistic, to strengthen the whole country in the war against terrorism. We are sending a clear signal that we will show our resolve to terrorize the terrorist, but in accordance with law. And I must congratulate the government for its very swift response, but also for its measured response. I think it's important not to have an element of overkill. It's important to focus the remedy to the situation which arises. The remedy cannot and should not be worse than the disease. We must also keep in mind that laws are not the only answer. A law and a legal framework is only part of a much larger holistic framework. And you are seeing different elements of that framework, whether it is coercive diplomacy globally, whether it is basic police reforms, which are the need of the hour and which are, I am sure, in the pipeline, whether it is logistical upgradation and reinforcement. And it is that holistic approach which alone will win us or get us ahead in the war on terror. One is also very happy to note that in the debate just 2 or 3 days ago, last week, on the Mumbai incident, several issues were discussed and raised, and many of them find concrete manifestation in the 2 bills before this House. There is the concrete manifestation of centralized approach the NIA, the special courts. These were all discussed and mentioned in several speeches and discussions we had a few days ago. Fast track approach, bail provisions, and other issues to which I will come as far as the nitty-gritty is concerned shortly. But the important thing is that these two bills, individually and together, represent a seamless web, an indivisible, comprehensive, seamless web which tries to deal with every facet and every aspect of terror, from training to funding to supplying. And therefore, it does something which is very important. It deals with the front visible face of terror. It deals with the middle end of terror, and it also seeks to deal with the back end of terror. And it also seeks to address, as I will presently show, every aspect of the preventive facet of dealing with terrorism, of detection, of apprehension and arrest, of search and seizure, of the questioning process, of the prosecution, and of the conviction and punishment. Because without all this, you cannot deal with terror. Let me first of all, as I said, disabuse my friend about our violation of his intellectual property rights, or about the alleged plagiarism which he reminded this House of. We are one on having a strong legal framework, but let me assure you, we are the ones who had brought in TADA. There can be no question of plagiarization. I'd start blaming you for POTA plagiarization from TADA if you blame me. We learned certain lessons from TADA and we therefore acted. But now let me just give you a few specific cases to show you why, far from there being a 99% similarity, there is a huge significant set of differences. First of all, and I'm happy to note that this is something the leader of the opposition talked about several times, about a central federal agency. But for whatever reason, he was unable to bring a bill, he was unable to implement. We are proud to actually have implemented a federal agency. And obviously, the federal agency is the implementing arm of a better legal framework. So obviously what you could not do with POTA, you have now a federal agency doing that. That's obviously a unique and different feature. Second, a definition of terrorism. Let me remind this House and my friend that the definition of terrorism in POTA was fairly large. But the definition of terrorism which we incorporated in the earlier version in 2004 of the Unlawful Act is now in fact much larger in the bill which you have today before us. It deals specifically, for example, with radioactive and nuclear issues. It deals specifically with hostage situations with very wide language. I'm not taking our time to take it to the language. It deals very directly with property, with pressures on public functionary, with disruption of supplies, all relating it to terrorism, all of which were absent in POTA, all of which were not there in POTA. So give us some credit where it is due, Mr. Jaitley. Then again, the punishment for dealing with radioactive substances, considerably enhanced, a specific new provision not found earlier, section 16. A separate, significant, comprehensive provision dealing with raising of funds for terrorist acts. Now I know there is a funding issue and a provision in POTA, but POTA had funding dealt with in the definition of a terrorist offence, and the funding dealt with there was much narrower. You now have a separate, independent, much larger and much more comprehensive provision dealing with all aspects of funding, very wide in the new act, not found in POTA. Two very important, extremely comprehensive, all-encompassing provisions about training camps and about recruitment of terrorists. 18A and 18B, completely new, not found. And then issues like bail, for example. My friend, in a sense, just caricatured the bail provision by telling you that the bail provision in Pota and the bail provision now is virtually identical. We have merely reincarnated language with slight differences. I'm afraid that's not so. You have to see the provision. The provision for bail in Pota puts a extremely heavy, in fact an impossible possibility of getting bail. We have in fact put that in this new act, in this new bill, but that is only for aliens, which says that you shall not get bail except in very exceptional circumstances, but that is only for non-Indian citizens, for foreigners. For Indians, the Pota provision said that the judge shall not grant bail unless the court is satisfied that there are grounds for believing that he is not guilty of committing an offence. A judge with merely an FIR and a charge sheet, for him to return a finding that the person is not guilty would be virtually impossible. The new provision in the current bill before you has a provision which I think harmoniously marries the demands of security and safety with a fair emphasis on the possibility of getting bail and on human right aspects. The current provision, and I remind you, is not identical, therefore, uses the very significant word prima facie and says, which is absent in the Pota, says reasonable grounds for believing that the accusation is prima facie true. That's a very different legal test. It's a very different legal test as lawyers know it, and lawyers should know it. It's a very different legal test as judges know it and as courts administer it. Then again, the issue, of course, of confessions, where again we are different from Pota because we have not included a admissible confession. And let me deal with that issue, because my friend, he has a fair point. For terrorism, why should you not render confessions admissible? Well, you could debate this point, but kindly consider, you have to measure the cost-benefit aspects of any provision. And we believe that perhaps the costs of rendering every confession to every police officer, even though above a certain rank, admissible, the cost far outweighs the benefit. You might need it and it might work in a few cases, but the abuse is so large as to justify not having it. Now the Rajiv Gandhi case is not a good example. The Rajiv Gandhi case is not a good example for the simple reason that there the conviction, as my friend rightly himself notes, was upheld under the normal law of 302, 302 murder charge. Tada was not the basis of that conviction. Just 3 or 4 weeks ago, we had no less than the Chief Justice of India, of this country, of course speaking extrajudicially, non-judicially, not from the bench, categorically saying that direct or blanket admissibility of confessions raises several issues of constitutionality, raises several issues and doubts and questions. Kartar Singh's case under Tada, a Supreme Court judgment which upheld the admissibility of confessions. That case has been specifically doubted by the Supreme Court. And I have no doubt, or at least there is every possibility, that in the near future, Kartar Singh will be reconsidered and might well be set aside or reviewed or modified. The Administrative Reforms Commission has raised a very valid point. It is not that we are per se against confessions admissibility for all times, but given the present state of our police system, the present state of training, of motivation, of facilities of the police system, with police reform still a long way ago, a long way afar, whether or not a admissibility of confessions should not await basic police reforms. We think it should. We think that we can reconsider this issue once we have had some reform. And let me assure my friend in this house that we are not toothless, we are not impotent in the face of terrorist attacks as far as admissibility is concerned, not at all. We have powers, we have the law. My friend knows better than anybody else. We have section 164 under 164, if you take the terrorist, and if he is interested in giving the example only of Kasab, let's take only Kasab's example. Kasab can be taken to the nearest magistrate 1 kilometer away from the jail, and my friend knows that the new bill will have special courts, and the magistrate can record his confession under 164, which is the ordinary law of the land. The confession is fully admissible. What's the problem? So please don't conjure up a fear psychosis that the country is without any law. It's a toothless tiger, it's a paper tiger, it is without any power, or it's impotent. The impotence may be there in our thought processes, it's not there in the law. And if for the time being we are not able to improve our police systems, well then I think this marries the fair demands of a certain emphasis on human rights along with a fair chance of conviction with confessions or without confessions, as you may choose. Friends, the federal agency aspect, as I said, we are very proud that we didn't talk about it, we actually did it. The previous government talked a lot about it, could not do it. The federal agency, I entirely agree with my friend. And to support his argument, let me add 2 or 3 more provisions. Terror, of course, is an all-India phenomenon. Terror, of course, is supportable under Entry 1, List 1, Defense of India. This is, after all, an indirect war on India. But there are other entries. As I said in the debate last week, the Committee on Law Justice has specifically pointed out, it's a report submitted to Parliament, that investigation and intelligence is specifically covered under Entry 8, List 1, under which we chose to only create a more truncated body, the CBI, but the power is much wider. And I also said in the debate and added that the first 3 entries of List 3, the concurrent list, law and order, the first 3 entries, Criminal Procedure Code and administration of the Criminal Procedure Code, would also cover this aspect. So to all the other parties, and there are obviously other parties here, not necessarily the BJP, which thinks that it's an assault on our federal structure, which thinks it's a dilution of our federal structure, they should be assured this is not a case of 356 gone amok. It is not a case of a lawless exercise of some kind of invasion of state rights. This is a limited, focused, regulated action on terrorism, fully sanctified and supported by the entries of the 7th schedule of the Constitution. And in any case, I doubt very much, with the great support of civil society, if any court of law in this country would want to strike it down as being ultra vires or beyond constitutional competence. There are very important provisions here about special courts, a point I touched upon in the debate, and right from Mrs. Indira Gandhi's time, the judgment of the Supreme Court, which says you can have special courts provided you give a judicial element. A special court, friends, and there is a whole chapter in this new bill which deals comprehensively with special courts, which will also be a kind of a fast track court, an FTC, for terrorism, which is the vital need of the hour. A special court does not mean that the executive chooses a special judge. A special court and a special judge are different. This is the basic principle of the Supreme Court judgment. When you remember, Mrs. Indira Gandhi was thought to be tried under the special courts set up then. And that principle is that so long as you have a consultative process with the judiciary in setting up special courts, and you have no power to choose the judge who mans them, then special courts are valid, they do a good job, they are faster, and I think they are absolutely vital in this case. There are, of course, special provisions in this bill, as far as I recollect it wasn't there in POTA, which puts a much more draconian power, a much more draconian and stringent power or regulatory framework against aliens, non-Indian citizens. As I said last time, the United States after 9/11 passed a series of laws which we all applauded, and we said that this is the way to deal with terror. But we forgot that all the stringent laws of USA, which enhanced the stringency of the laws about arrest, about detention, were all about aliens, not domestic US citizens. Well, here in India we have actually created a very stringent provision about aliens who come into this country. They cannot by a specific provision be granted bail at all, unless the phrase used is exceptional circumstances. It's a different, larger issue which need not be detailing this House, whether under our more comprehensive constitutional scheme, such a special provision for aliens or non-Indian citizens will be upheld by the courts, because both Article 14 of our Constitution and Article 21 of our Constitution, the right to life and liberty, apply to Indian citizens and non-Indian citizens alike, something far wider than the USA, which is why the USA could have something like Guantanamo Bay, but not Article 14 and 21 of our Constitution, but that's a different issue. Friends, 90 days is liable to be extended to 180 days. The basic spirit and approach of these new bills is that the policemen, the NSG commando, the forces which fight terror on our behalf are not only strengthened directly, but also have the spirit and the feeling and the motivation in their minds that whatever they are doing is not futile. That when they do something and they arrest somebody and they try somebody, all their efforts will not go in vain, or the person will not escape scot-free. And that is the purpose of all these provisions. And therefore, obviously, because terrorists inspire fear, they generate a certain feeling of fear psychosis, investigation is slower, witnesses are more difficult to find, and therefore the extendability to 180 days in a particular case if the judge so wants, from the normal 60 or 90 days is a welcome additional step. Mr. Chairman, sir, I'll just take a few minutes more. Ultimately, this whole issue cannot be really effectively dealt with without strengthening the backbone of the system. And the backbone of the system is and will always remain the beat constable, the ordinary police forces. The entirety of the huge police reforms which we know every detail about, police reforms as per the Police Commission or as per the Administrative Reforms Commission or any number of other committees, they have to go step in step. The pace and the momentum and the direction of these legislative changes have to be maintained through those police reforms. There is now a wealth of information through Supreme Court directions on police reform. I know that the states are resisting. The states have a different approach and a different view. But I put it to this august House, some of the union territories, because today we are discussing a bill from the central government. The central government can make an example and lead by way of example in a union territory, where, at least in some union territories where the central government has some power to make laws, where the police force can be revamped. Certainly, Chinese walls can be created between the prosecution, the investigation and the operation. Why should we not have at least two of these Chinese walls, if not three? The person who operates on the field should not be investigating, and the investigator should not be going to court every day to prosecute. And then you can apply simple, new, innovative schemes to deal with these divisions for more effective. For example, as I said in the other debate, if you can have an insurance cover for all your operational police force of 1 crore for death and 50 lakhs for serious disability. This can be done if you create that division. Mr. Chairman, sir, I am very grateful for the time given. In the ultimate analysis, what is important is that by and large, despite the few self-congratulatory pats on the back, despite the "we told you so's," and despite the allegations of plagiarism, this is a united effort substantially and largely, and that is the message of unity which we send out to the whole world. I have no doubt that it is not only in the legislative framework, but in the actual implementational reality that that unity and that spirit will continue to pervade and therefore ultimately win us the victory over the terrorists. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Singh. Sri Sitaram Yechury.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, sir. I rise today, sir, with the specific intention of seeking to enrich both the legislations that have been moved by the Home Minister through concrete amendments in order to strengthen our fight against terrorism, our country's fight against terrorism, and at the same time also to preserve the inviolability of the federal structure of the Indian Constitution. So while fighting terrorism and maintaining and preserving the federal structure, we do not think these are mutually contradictory or exclusive objectives. I do not subscribe, sir, that in order to fight terrorism, we require laws which will conflict with the rights of the people and individuals as human rights or fundamental rights enshrined in our Constitution, or the rights of the states as enshrined under the federal structure of our Constitution. I fully agree that every freedom has a reasonable restriction. But are these laws going beyond these reasonable restrictions? Are they violative of the fundamental understanding and the conception of our Constitution is a very important matter that we cannot ignore. So therefore, the amendments that we would propose, I'll come to that later, is in order to strengthen both the objectives. Strengthen the fight against terrorism through these new laws, at the same time preserve the rights of the individuals and the rights of the states, which, I repeat, I do not think are contradictory or mutually exclusive. This, sir, I think is very important for us in this August House, because after all, we are the Council of States. The rights of the states under the Indian Constitution is something which we, as the Council of States, ought to be the custodians to protect. So therefore, we require to pay a little more attention to this aspect. And that is where I would like also to draw the attention of the House to recollect that the Constitution of India defines our country as the Union of Indian States. It is not the Indian Republic. It's not the Republic of India. It's the Union of Indian States. And behind that is the rich understanding of federalism in a diversity which doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. There's no country which has such a rich plurality and diversity. And a federal structure in this background is a very important entity in keeping our country together. So therefore, we will have to maintain that essence, sir, and I don't think any measure should be taken which can be violative of that. And if we are doing that, I'm afraid we are going to cut the branch on which we are sitting. So therefore, I repeat once again that I do not see the objective of strengthening our fight against terrorism as being in any way contradictory to preserving the federal content of our Constitution. And so in this connection, it is also important to again recollect the Constitution of India talks of India, that is, i.e. Bharat. It is not India, i.e. Hindustan. It is India, i.e. Bharat. There's a big philosophical understanding behind that. That by Hindustan, even by mistake, even if we do not want to mean it, but if that meaning is conveyed, that this is the land only of the Hindus, then we are actually negating the very concept and conception of modern India. I'm raising this point, sir, that precisely to underline the fact that the fight against terrorism is not only a battle that has to be done through laws. The fight against terrorism is finally also a political battle where we have to create in our country conditions which cannot provide the fertile ground for terrorism to thrive. And if that has to be provided, then the secular credentials, the secular foundations of India will have to be strengthened, and the political atmosphere and climate has to be brought about where the fight against terrorism cannot be politicized, cannot be communalized, and India cannot afford it if we want to win the war against terror. And that background is necessary because unfortunately, I think so far it has been a rather legalistic debate that you've had. I understand both our esteemed colleagues are lawyers of reputation, and since they've gone into the various clauses, but I thought unless we get back the political backdrop in which we are discussing this issue, I think we'll be missing the essence. And in this context, sir, before I come to the actual contents of some of the refinements that I'm asking the government to please accept, and concrete amendments have been moved there, is that in the statement of objectives and reasons for the National Investigation Agency, the Honorable Home Minister has here argued the need for such an agency, which I am not disputing. I'll come to that later. But one of the reasons that he's in is because of the innumerable incidents of terrorist attacks where there is a specific mention of left-wing extremism. Now, I have no objections to that fact because we have been victims of left-wing extremism. Very recently, our Chief Minister, Honorable Chief Minister of West Bengal, there was an attack on him by these elements. So we are in the forefront to combat it. But if you're mentioning left-wing extremism, sir, shouldn't right-wing extremism also find place? Why is that omitted? You had these entire investigations that have been done into Malegaon blasts. You had the Nanded blasts. Now the trail has reached the Samjhauta Express blasts. And you had a military school that has come under the radar of these operations. If all this is our recent experience, why is it that you only mention left-wing extremism and omit right-wing extremism? All varieties of extremism. As I repeat, terrorism knows neither religion, nor region, nor caste, nor creed. Terrorism has to be fought united as India and as Indians, and therefore do not give, even in your statement of objects and reasons, such an impression that this is directed only at one particular stream or one direction. That will not make us win our battle against terror. And that is something I think we'll have to uncompromisingly state. And here, sir, therefore, I would say that please, let us discuss these bills in the background with the gravity and sincerity that the fight against terrorism cannot be conducted on the playground of politics and politicking. The fight against terrorism has to be conducted as a serious business. It is not a question of some minority vote bank or a majority vote bank on either sides of these accusations that are being hurled, but this is an issue which, as patriots, each one of us will have to stand up to this to fight, and it's in that spirit, sir, I'm making these concrete suggestions for the consideration of the House. The national investigation agencies. There was a time, I confess, when my party and people on the left were very apprehensive of creation of such a federal agency. But today, for two reasons, we are supporting the creation of such an agency, and the reasons are the following. One is that we have seen in the recent terrorist attacks that there has been a woeful inadequacy in the coordination between the various intelligence gathering agencies in our country. And that we have also seen, we have been through that debate only the other week here in this House. I do not want to repeat all that's happened in Mumbai, but the fact remains that there is a need for greater coordination between all these agencies. You have the Intelligence Bureau, you have the RANW, you have the military intelligence, you have the state intelligence. I mean, all these inputs, but some authority in order to coordinate all that will have to be created. But somehow that is not in the ambit of this agency. This agency, from the law that has been drafted, comes into the picture only post the event. After the attack has occurred, after the event has happened, then this act comes into force. Fine, that part of it I'll come to. But the other area that prior to the event occurring, the coordination that is required, the government must pay attention to that aspect and also come with some concrete proposal on that aspect. Our honorable senior colleague, sir, who's here, who was the Home Minister for all these years since under the UPA government, as the political leader, his head has rolled, but the entire apparatus, the administrative setup that you have underneath in all this intelligence gathering in the security agencies is intact as it was, as though there's nothing has been wrong there. There's not one officer called to be accountable, not one person who's been asked why this lapse has happened.